mainly part of the reasons is that our infrastructure is not steady. It's not that we can predict something based on this month and expect that next month is going to behave the same, because it's not. It never is. And when I'm trying to calculate the cost of migration for a specific project like that and take into account that it's going to take you a year or two to the future to migrate to the cloud and the need of hiring, and there's so many factors, it's almost impossible to predict on something that is super accurate.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 149. What is FinOps? Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick. Victor, we spend a lot of time in cloud. But not only do we spend a lot of time in cloud, we spend a lot of money in cloud.
Oh, yeah. I'm not sure whether we spend a lot of money or our companies are spending a lot of money, but a lot of money goes away, yes.
Well, I'm probably spending $30 a month just because I've got S3 costs and I've got domains and I got other stuff. But in a large company, in an enterprise, it's not unheard of to see 5, 6, dare I say, even 7-figure monthly spends in cloud. And what do you do when you're trying to figure out, why is this? I thought this cloud thing was going to make my life easier, not bankrupt me.
Oh, I mean, nothing says that your life being easier does not mean that it's more expensive, right? I would even go as far as to say that any simplification of something comes as the cost. So making it easier is usually related to being more expensive. That's what people are charging you for, right? I have this service, it will make X easier only if you give me this amount of money.
So with cloud costs in mind, we brought a guest on today. We have Roi Ravhon on from Finout. Roi, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Darren. Thanks for having me.
And I messed up your last name. I apologize. Why don't you introduce yourself real quick and talk a little bit about what Finout does, and we'll talk about how cloud costs really factor into organizations.
As you mentioned, my name is Roi Ravhon. I know it's tough. Before Finout, I spent time as an engineering director in a company called Logs.io, which is kind of a Splunk and Datadog competitor. And major part of my role was to deal with the cloud cost and the ever-increasing cloud cost. Because it's not only that we paid for AWS more every month, is that we started to pay for more and more vendors every month. And usually we would get phone calls from leadership asking us, hey guys, our AWS bill is up by 5% again this month. Is this okay? This is what we're expected. And more often than not, the answer to this question was a lot more complex than what it should have been. And breaking multi-tenancy and, looking at all of the infrastructure in Kubernetes and storage that we use in order to run the platform, and being able to assign it to specific customers or tenants or features or business units was one of the biggest challenges that we faced on a daily basis. So we decided that we need to start a company in order to solve that, and in order to create the next generation kind of solutions that integrates with all providers and all different services across the organization, regardless of if it's cloud or if it's notification services, CDNs, storage, data warehouses, and so on. And combine that cost with your business performance and KPIs and technical metrics all the way, so we can get the cost per unit economic and cost per something that is forever increasing, which can give us better visibility into our environment and to better explain why we're growing. So this is Finout in a nutshell.
I remember back in 2012, 13, 14, I was working at a startup. Our initial monthly costs were $5,000, $6,000, and they, I will say, ballooned up to, I think, roughly $20,000 a month. But we were willing to do that because we had no other really fixed costs, and we had to run the business. But looking back on it, we probably could have cut those costs by at least 30 to 40%. but there was no good visibility at that point. And really, we were a small team. We were 5-6 people. And it seems like I really should have been focused more on that. So why should teams today, especially in 2022, really be focused on their cloud costs?
When the company is created, all you want to do is just generate value, right? You want to beat the time to market, to have our developers working on something as fast as we can and sell the product regardless of how much it costs us to manufacture it. When we start to scale, we tend to look at SaaS very similar to what factories are, right? We have raw material that the customer is giving us, and we process it with our code and with our infrastructure all the way to the point that we have something that's worth money. And in that process, we need to get our value and we need to get our margin out of the deal. And when cloud becomes the second expense in most companies after salaries, it's clear that to maintain a healthy gross margin, we need to be able to optimize our chain. So it's not just a matter of selling and producing good and viable ARR. We need to have viable deals. We need to show that we can grow and we can maintain a healthy business. So cloud cost becomes a very big problem for organizations the more mature they become. And it's not just because they're spending money. It's because they're spending money and have no projection of what's going on. And it's very hard to tie that to the business and tie that to our business performance as well.
So what would be a typical example of something somebody can save on? Not shutting down clusters overnight or using expensive VMs. How do you measure what can be improved?
When the company starts with their cost optimization journey, there's usually the immediate suspects, right? We can purchase RIs, we can purchase saving plans, we can migrate some workloads to spot instances. We usually have idle snapshots and EBSs that we're not using or over-provisioned. So there's lots of money that is left on the table without doing anything super hard for the company that we just can go ahead and optimize. So usually when the company starts to pay attention to cloud costs, this is the first things that they're doing. They can cut 20 to 30% of the cloud cost without working too hard. There are lots of tools in the market that can help with doing those kind of optimizations. But then we left off with a super complicated cloud build that we still can't understand. And cloud build can be changed and moved throughout various different changes within an organization. So it can be one commit that engineer pushed to production that changed the amount of times of a scheduled task we're running from 2 to 3. This can increase our cloud cost by a third, and no one even noticed that. The engineer has no idea of what's the implication of what they're doing. And we can also have it from the customer side. So maybe we have a customer that was super profitable, and the day after they change the usage pattern and they start to overload us with super complicated API calls and searches that are taking a lot more resources than us, and we need to scale more in order to support that. And AWS themselves can change their prices and change the way that they're acting on. So we always have different axes within the organization that constantly changes, and we always need to make sure that we're on top, and we can make sure that we always know what we're charging off and how can we deal with it over time and identify those anomalies that are when we're growing and not matching that to the business. I mean, we're just spending more money without producing more software, more KPIs, more whatever.
What's been one of the more interesting, okay, you did this and this caused you to go up in 20, 30, 40% in spend? What's one of those real life scenarios that you've seen?
So a lot of the time we're seeing engineers that are changing stuff without actually understanding what's the implication. So the example I gave before with changing the frequency of a daily report that was generated from 2 times to 3 times because an engineer wanted to give the customer a better experience. But in reality, the cost spiked by 30% just by doing that. So this is something that we saw in multiple organizations, the exact same issue. Or if I have, an ingestion pipeline is something that is very, very similar to many companies. We are getting lots of data and we need to process it from one place to another. And for the components that are, somewhere down that ingestion chain, even 5 milliseconds that we increased with another verification that we added to the code can really impact and have implication on the entire company financial structure. So getting those engineers to be informed to what they're doing is one of the main goals of FinOps, the new perception and framework that started in the world to solve exactly that.
When we talk about costs, right, we talk about multiple aspects of it. Like, this is how much I pay to AWS, this is how much I pay for this service, that service, this is how much my people are costing me, right? You mentioned at the very beginning that cloud cost is the second biggest cost usually in a company, right? How do you correlate those different costs? Because I imagine we could right now make a decision to move our database to RDS. Self-hosting it right now, we'll make a decision to use RDS. Now, what I can optimize there and how expensive RDS is, I guess, has two different aspects, right? How much can I optimize RDS itself to maybe run on cheaper servers and so on and so forth, but also how much does that cost compared to, let's say, self-hosted database, which in case of self-hosted means not only, let's say, VMs where I will run that database, but also overhead in managing it. Can we somehow correlate not only the pure cost of certain services, but also people?
When a company looks at its expenses, it usually have different sections for infrastructure and for labor, because labor is not part of the gross margin usually. So it's less expensive to hire people to do something rather to buy it on a monthly renewal basis. But it is one of the challenges that many companies are facing, right? We have 10 engineers that are supporting storage and optimizations and networking and everything. And now they can just migrate that workload to the cloud. And it can be one of the cloud providers, and it can also be a managed service like Snowflake, for example. So migrating that can be a very difficult task in engineering wise, but when the company looks and calculates its long-term ROI, getting the cost that we spent it on-prem with the engineers that we needed to face that minus the migration cost and the ownership, usually the cloud providers win. And because that we have superior technology and they can do things that is very, very hard to do on-premise today, right? That the cloud started to be so advanced and a lot cheaper than what it was compared to a few years ago. So many companies, especially enterprises, are facing that problem and trying to calculate if it's worth it or not to migrate to the cloud. And we see that more and more companies are starting to do that exactly, which just gets the problem to be a lot more severe.
One of the things you just said there was usually the cloud providers win. When do the cloud providers not win?
There are specific scenarios that the cloud providers are still more expensive, and I think it really, really depends on the type of company and workload. But one of the most famous stories that it's the Dropbox migrated their storage to on-prem because the cloud providers simply was too expensive. Dropbox still used cloud providers for many of the things, but storage specifically was one of the reasons that they needed to migrate. So I think for most companies that are not huge enterprises and very technical oriented that can really deal with those kinds of migrations, cloud is always winning for the mid-market and for many cases of the enterprises as well. And it's need to be a very extreme use case that it's going to be worth building it on your own.
How can people predict how much something will cost? To begin with, AWS itself is unpredictable. Or my brain does not have enough mental capacity to figure it out. Nobody knows how much something will cost, let's say in AWS, but doesn't have to be. And to make those things more complicated, how do you know how much that will simplify the human aspect, or how many less people you will need to do the work once you migrate? I have a feeling that many companies are just completely failing to figure out things in advance, right? One thing is to retroactively say, hey, this month, like the example you had, this month you had 20% increase in cost. If you do this, then you can go back to where you were. But can we be proactive and figure it out in advance?
I think it's a very, very difficult question to answer. And I think in reality, many just fail with calculating that exactly because there's so many hidden factors. And even if you're running on AWS for 1 month, predicting them next month is a big challenge. So not even running on AWS and figure out how much that is going to cost you and how it's going to be the structure is huge. And I think mainly part of the reasons is that our infrastructure is not steady. It's not that we can predict something based on this month and expect that next month is going to behave the same, because it's not. It never is. And when I'm trying to calculate the cost of migration for a specific project like that and take into account that it's going to take you a year or two to the future to migrate to the cloud and the need of hiring, and there's so many factors that it's almost impossible to predict on something that is super accurate. But I think it's something that many organizations, especially enterprises, are trying to do. It's a problem that I know that AWS is facing a lot. I mean, AWS is trying to convince enterprises that it's going to be worthwhile to do that migration. And we know that AWS is struggling with that as well. I mean, it's very not an easy solution. There is no easy solution for that.
Do people really expect their cloud costs to stay stable? That seems sort of strange, because if a company is growing, I would expect everything around it to cost more to operate over time.
So lots of companies don't expect it, obviously, to remain stable because you're absolutely right. We need to spend more money in order to have more customers and to have more data. But the very big questions that many organizations face is how much are we going to grow? Because it's not growing linearly. If I'm going to double my income and my ARR, it's not means that I'm going to double my infrastructure, because we have fixed cost that is regardless of how many more new business I will get. I don't need to purchase more services and storage that getting higher and higher discounts the more that I'm using. So there's so many different things that can move, and predictions becomes one of the biggest struggles that organization have. They start the month, I don't know how they're starting it, but how it's going to end, it's a very, very different problem to solve, and especially when organizations need to have predictions for 3 years in the future in order to have the enterprise agreements with AWS. So predicting that far is something that is almost impossible to do for many organizations.
So let me set up a hypothetical here. If I'm running a company that is providing a SaaS, and let's say it's a multi-tenant SaaS, I'm not doing dedicated one-offs for everybody, white labeling, if you will. How can I, as that SaaS vendor, how can I figure out how much each of those specific customers are really costing me?
I think this is one of the toughest questions out there currently for SaaS operating. And this is what Finout is here to solve. Essentially, what we can do is we need to decouple the cost with the customers. So instead of looking at how much do I pay for each storage, RDS, instance, whatever, what you want to start to measure is how much do I pay for each unit economics. So if, for example, we are producing a price per purchase or price per click or price per event or impression or transaction or stream or whatever that we're selling as a company, this is the cost that we can start and measure, and this is the cost that we can actually use to predict and to allocate what we're using. So instead of trying to get one instance and allocate specific parts of it to my customers, what we can do is we can take a group of infrastructure and then match a KPI of how much they're actually using, how much clicks or events or streams or whatever KPI that we have has been transferred through those instances and those infrastructure. And correlating that, this is what the FinOps culture calls a unit cost. This is how much do I pay for each unit, regardless of how much did I pay for the infrastructure itself. And when I have those unit costs, I can go ahead and start to allocate them back to my customers. So I know that customer A has used 5 API calls, 10 searches, and 1,000 clicks throughout the system. I know what is the price for each of those unit economics. So that way I can calculate how much do I pay for each customer, how much do I pay for each feature, for each business unit, because I'm passing through the business. I'm connecting the business to the technology behind the scenes. Does it make sense?
As much as it can. But one thing you said there was a buzzword that we haven't mentioned yet. And it was FinOps, not DevOps, but FinOps. What the heck is FinOps?
FinOps is a new name for something that is going on for a while within the organization. So FinOps is a movement that started, I think, 2 years ago, somewhere in the year 2020, by one of the founders of Cloudability, J.R. Stormont, and Mike Fuller from Atlassian. They wrote the book about how to practice FinOps and how organization can adapt that framework in order to have their engineers more informed, basically to generate more money out of every dollar that is spent in the cloud. FinOps is not about cost saving. Cost saving is a byproduct of adapting FinOps, but FinOps is a movement. It's a framework. It's like DevOps. With time, we see now that there are FinOps personnel within organization that have that title. So the same that happened with DevOps, right? We have that perception, we have that framework of how to work and how to combine engineering with system, and then a new position emerged into the world that's called DevOps. So we see the same with FinOps, is how to connect finance and engineering and translate to one another, and to have engineers thinking about the financial aspects of what they're doing, and to have finance more informed of how their infrastructure is going to behave. So I think FinOps is a lot more than a buzzword now. FinOps, there's the FinOps Foundation that is part of the Linux Foundation, and we're a formal part of it, by the way. And we see that there are hundreds of new participants every month that are joining that foundation, and more practitioners throughout the world is building and contributing to FinOps. And it's an amazing thing to see evolving in front of our eyes.
Is it realistic to expect engineers to really be more informed and make informed decisions based on a cost perspective versus a technical perspective?
I really think so, because when we write a code, it's not something that is running in vacuum. We write it in order to serve the business. And if we're writing something that is subpar and not optimal, and eventually we're losing money on the service that we're writing, so obviously it's a bad code, even if it's performing well and beats all expectations. So engineers want to have a positive contribution to the business. And there are some companies that engineers are even optimizing their gross margin as a part of their OKRs. So engineers really want to get into that game. And we see that many organizations that starts to implement FinOps, engineers starts with resenting that and thinking of FinOps as the big brother that's here to make sure that they're not overspending. But once engineers starts to embrace that culture, it becomes more of even of a gamification of the infrastructure. Engineers wants to optimize the cost KPI together with the KPIs that's being measured on a usual basis. Engineers really do care about the infrastructure and about the application to the business. It's amazing transformation to see organization having.
I can see that happening in small to maybe medium-sized businesses, but in large and enterprise, no way. I can't see how that could even happen.
Larger enterprise are probably going to work a bit different. There are very big enterprises that have FinOps practitioners in place. Enterprises usually look at it as a bigger vision, a bigger thing. They call it usually a cloud center of excellence. As the big department is there to optimize everything cost related. But enterprise is essentially not one company, right? There are very multiple organizations within the enterprise, and each organization can optimize their own KPI and usually have their own ARR and being measured differently, being priced differently. So getting those engineers within the sub-organization informed is tougher to do from an enterprise perspective, but something that can be evolved in each of the business unit that the enterprise have. So I think as usual, enterprises are slower to adopt a new framework, a newer concept, but it's not something that they can just ignore. It's a trend that's happening in the world, and it's not going anywhere.
Anytime I hear the phrase center of excellence, all I hear is cost center, because most of the time a center of excellence is not well executed. Rather, it's actually poorly executed if executed at all.
It's a great question. I can't say anything smart about it, but we do see that there are full organizations within enterprises that call themselves cloud center of excellence, that have both FinOps practices and optimizing procurement and optimizing the processes within an organization. Only time will tell how well would it work. But they started even before FinOps was codified, because the enterprises experienced that first. They spent so much money that it became unviable to use the cloud. So someone had to start and optimize it, and someone had to take charge on what's happening.
Do we see optimizations moving across clouds as well? What I'm trying to say is that one thing is saying, hey, you're running in AWS. If you do X, it will be cheaper or better for the same price, and so on and so forth. Do people move from one cloud to another because of costs?
So I think changing your entire infrastructure from one cloud to another is such a painful process within an organization that it's usually unviable. You need to save so much money in order for you to actually do that. But what we do see is that more and more organizations start to purchase solutions from specific cloud providers or different vendors across the industry. So look at what happened to Snowflake stock. I mean, it's not by accident. People stopped using Athena and BigQuery and started to use Snowflake instead, because it's a superior data warehouse. It's better, it's cheaper from the long run. And we see more and more organizations start to purchase those best-in-breed solutions. So people are purchasing Akamai instead of using CloudFront, right? And security products are usually something that you get from the outside. And it's a trend that I think we're going to see more and more in the next couple of years, of more organizations are leaving the cloud providers for the managed services that are very niche and just pick the best solution out there in the market in order to support the workloads.
When a company is currently running on-prem and then AWS approaches them and Azure approaches them, another cloud vendor trying to close the deal, do they consult solutions related to FinOps before making the deal? Because once I guess that there is that cost optimization once you're in AWS or Azure or whatever. How can we make things within that ecosystem better? Does it influence also the decision where to go in the first place? In practice, I mean, I know that in theory it could, but how often do they try to figure out that in advance before signing the deal?
So we see that the cloud providers are offering FinOps as a service solutions for the migration, and it's a very tough battle to have, right? Because you still want to make money, but you want to cut the prices just to get the enterprise working with you, and you know that there is going to be a very difficult fight throughout all major providers, and it's all a matter of the completeness of package that you're going to get. So probably everyone are going to be around the same, and maybe you'll have a specific use case that's going to be significantly cheaper with one of the cloud providers. But if not, it's going to sum up to the service that you're going to get and how much they're going to accompany you throughout the process, and if they'll be able to support you after the journey once you figure out that you're spending so much money and it's going to be very hard to migrate back. So it is something that the cloud providers themselves are talking about. And you can see that the tools that the cloud providers have, like Cost Explorer, has pretty much closed the gap with other vendors in the market, and companies can actually use that when it was not the case 2 or 3 years ago.
If we're looking at a specific cloud provider, let's say I'm running Kubernetes in AWS, I could immediately see a cost savings by going and running GKE Autopilot, just picking 2 things out of the pocket. How would I know to do that? I mean, I know that Google Cloud is there, but how can I get a leading indicators like, hey, we see, and I don't know if this is what Finout does or not, but hey, you're spending $20,000 a month with EKS. If you were to move to GKE Autopilot, you would only be spending $8,000 a month based on your past 3 months history. Is that something that is even possible to figure out?
It's hard to figure out, but it is technically possible, and it's one of the things that we have on the roadmap here for Finout, because we see that use case, and Kubernetes brings lots of opportunities together with it, right? So it's not just a buzzword, it's not just a modern OS, it's having those kind of migrations between AWS and GKE when you're running on Kubernetes suddenly become viable. And using Kubernetes labels, both for pods and for nodes and for whatever use case that we're running, can even help us break down multi-tenancy and have better visibility into our environment. So Kubernetes is a lot of headache, right, in terms of cost management, because it's abstract what we're seeing from the cloud providers, and we're paying in instances, but we're using pods, right? But together with that headache, we get tons of potential possibilities, both for migrations and cost saving and cost allocation that we can only dreamed of before the Kubernetes era.
So if people wanted to find out more about Finout, what's the best way to do it? And if people wanted to get in contact with you?
We have our calendar based on the Finout website. Everyone can schedule a meeting with us to hear more about what we're doing. We're starting to get a product more and more mature and ready to get more companies out there. So essentially companies that wants to have a new kind of product that change the way that we think of modern cost management, that is going to be very easy to integrate. We are not asking anything to be installed on the environment. We can get a Kubernetes level breakdown just by looking at Datadog. I mean, we're the next generation of solutions, and it's easier, no perspective, no need to define anything in advance. So we are here to elaborate more and to show what can be done with Finout and how we can achieve that cost per customer, standard for all companies.
Okay, so all of Roi's contact information and more information about Finout will be down in the show notes. Roi, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.